Hello, I am Marcia Ferranto, CEO of the National Law Enforcement Memorial and Museum. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our highly acclaimed virtual program series. The exploration of some of this country's most creative and thoughtful solutions to the challenges faced by our law enforcement is an important part of understanding the full story of American law enforcement, especially when law enforcement in our communities can work together to solve these challenges. We are fortunate to have this team of experts assembled today to discuss the challenges of enforcing coronavirus regulations, the impact it has had across different communities, and how that has affected initiatives that are focused on more equitable policing. We are able to bring this program to you today thanks to the generosity of the team at Target, who has been an event sponsor several times this year, and we are grateful for their continued support. Target's core values are aligned with connecting law enforcement with the communities they serve all around the nation, and we are honored to be partnering with Target on this program today. So let me start with a little bit of housekeeping. All attendees are muted. If you would like to ask a question, please submit a question through the Q&A tab. Please note that everyone in the webinar will be able to see your question. You can upvote questions submitted by other attendees. Our staff will prioritize answering the questions that receive the most votes. A link to the recording of this webinar will be sent to everyone in 2 days and will also be available on the museum's YouTube channel. We are committed to providing greater accessibility to our programs and are offering ASL interpretation and closed captioning for you today. Panelists, please remember to keep yourselves on mute when you are not speaking. It is my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker today, Commissioner Ed Davis. Commissioner Davis has served as a law enforcement officer for over 35 years and is the former police commissioner of Boston, most known as Boston's lead police official during the tragic marathon bombing, and for testifying before Congress about the bombing and the lessons learned. Prior to this role as commissioner, he also held the position of superintendent of the Lowell Police Department for 12 years after climbing the ranks from patrol officer beginning in 1978. Commissioner Davis has also worked internationally on police issues in Singapore, London, Northern Ireland, Jordan, and Israel. He has also served on the Police Executive Research Forum's Board of Directors and was the founding member and first president of the Massachusetts Major City Chiefs Association. Welcome, Commissioner Davis.
Thank you so much, Marcia. Thank you for that kind introduction. And my sincere thanks to you and Thomas for letting me be part of this impressive panel of people who are going to talk about something that is really an unprecedented challenge. I'm thrilled to be able to talk to my former colleagues after being out for 6 years, and I'm particularly thrilled that September 9th is the day that I'm here, because 42 years ago today I walked into the Massachusetts Police Academy. So that was quite an experience and led to a very exciting career and an opportunity to serve the communities that I worked in, that I'm very proud of. And of course, going into police academy in 1978 indicates that when I was in high school, there were a lot of protests going on in the 1960s. So I lived through that era, and I saw the difficulty that was occurring in the country around the Vietnam War, and the focus on the soldiers and what the country was doing. And this is a similar kind of a situation where it's clear that there are inequities in the United States, in our government, in our cities, that include policing, start with policing actually, and then go beyond into other areas like healthcare and particularly education. In my time in the police departments I've led, I spent a lot of time interacting with the commissioners of education and visited schools frequently, and the inequities there are shocking and need to be addressed. But like 1966 and 67 and 68, the community has identified law enforcement as sort of the point of the spear on these issues, and we are experiencing a very difficult time of legitimacy and trust. And I think it's extremely important, and I know that speaking to my colleagues across the country, there are strong efforts to reintroduce community policing to what we do, to concentrate on openness and trust and transparency, and make sure that when we do something, we explain to the community why we did it, and also retrain our officers to concentrate on de-escalation and better ways of dealing with the use of force, which is always controversial and never looks good when anybody is employing it. But unfortunately, it's a necessary part of what policing is all about, because frankly, when we tell somebody they're under arrest, very frequently they object to that proposition. So we've got to find a way to earn the public's trust and to have them understand that what we're doing is appropriate and necessary, but it first has to be appropriate and necessary. And I think that that's the challenge that we have. So the reason I talk about that at length is because it really is critical to this panel. This panel is talking about COVID response and the implementation and enforcement of health regulations that are focused on the community good. There clearly is scientific evidence that following guidelines that have been issued by the CDC and other health experts will save lives. And so we're being asked, the police are being asked to step into the role of enforcement along rules that are being implemented and promulgated by health officials. With the backdrop of the protests and the issues around trust of police behind everything we do right now, that makes an already difficult job almost impossible. And I'll give you an example of where I have run into this myself in the last year. Starting in the second week of March, my company was called in to run command centers at various international organizations. John Hancock and Manulife Insurance, for instance. Another company was one of the top retailers in the world. I'm not at liberty to disclose the name, but they're a Fortune 100 company. And they asked us to really take over the command center in the initial response to COVID. And as part of that responsibility, we set up the command post, we were getting streams of intelligence from all over the country and different parts of the world where this retailer is located. And it became very clear very quickly that the common sense, legitimate orders and directions that were being put out by governors and public health directors across the country were not being followed very well. And I sat there with the CEO of this corporation, and we had a debate about how you deal with somebody who comes into your store that isn't following the guidelines that the state has issued. And quite frankly, we had honest conversations about the challenges that police departments were facing in enforcing these rules and some of the tragedies that were occurring around the country. I know there are people on this call that experienced some of these tragedies, and security people were assaulted, employees were assaulted by individuals who had a strong sense of their constitutional rights and their lack of interest in masking up and doing other things. So how does a retailer deal with that? How can you start to enforce laws on your customers? Well, frankly, we made a decision after a lot of debate and discussion that we would take a pass on this, that we would not enforce these rules. We would put signs on the front door. We would request that people follow the rules, but we would never get ourselves in a confrontational situation. If someone ignored us and didn't want to cooperate with the rules, we flipped it off to the police, and that was a viable alternative for a major corporation in the United States who made a very, very thoughtful and researched response involving attorneys and police experts and retail experts. The bottom line was this: we were handing that back to the police and saying, this is your hot potato. There's nothing we can do that's going to help this situation, especially in the environment that we're seeing in cities. One of our stores was burnt to the ground in one of the initial protests, and we were all there that night when that was happening and felt quite hopeless and helpless when it was going on. But the bottom line is this: the police have an almost impossible job to do right now. There's the merging of the crisis of confidence in policing, as well as the crisis of COVID. And you know, like in the past, we're being brought in to do the difficult and almost impossible jobs. So I thank you all, the people who are on this call, and you know, I speak to my former colleagues from various departments who have stepped down, the police chief in LA, the police chief in New York, the police chief in Chicago, and we're all, you know, very happy that we're not in the business. But that happiness is also measured with real sympathy for the officers and the people who are out there trying to do this very difficult job in this almost impossible environment. And I want to thank you for your service and thank you for all the work that you do day in and day out. But let me just say that you will prevail here. The goodwill of the men and women who are in this profession, and most importantly, the good deeds that happen every single day across America because of the work that police do, will eventually rise to the top here. We need to make serious change. We need to identify and change practices that are not working or are overly oppressive. But at the same time, what we do is fundamental to the safety of this country. So I thank you all for your service.
Commissioner Davis, thank you so much for your remarks and for carving out time in your schedule today to be with us. It is very, very meaningful for us. Thank you.
Thank you much.
Okay, I would like to, at this point, introduce our moderator, Ganesha Martin. Most recently, Ganesha served as the director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, where she oversaw collaborative criminal justice efforts that included the Baltimore Police Department, Baltimore State's Attorney's Office, Governor's Office of Crime Control and Prevention, Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, U.S. Attorney's Office, the Judiciary, and several community groups. Ganesha is a lawyer who led the federal court-ordered consent decree reform efforts at the Baltimore Police Department from 2015 to 2018. As chief of the Department of Justice Compliance, Accountability, and External Affairs Division, Ganesha collaborated with DOJ Civil Rights Division attorneys that ultimately led to the consent decree. In her current consulting practice, Ganesha focuses on uniting communities of color and the police as she consults on consent decree compliance and police reform matters for police departments across the country. Ganesha, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I thank both you and Thomas for putting together such an important panel on equitable policing. You know, we don't find very many spaces where we can have this conversation, and I think it's important for us to be able to do that in a collaborative way. And so I do want to, you know, encourage everyone who's joined us today and taken time out of their schedule, that not only to ask questions, but certainly if you've had these issues and you've been confronted with them in your own professional or personal life, to share some of the things that you've been able to do. So I always think it's important to talk about issues, and, you know, as Commissioner Davis talked about, these are tough. You know, there's no easy one size fits all solutions. And so I hope that we can walk away today by utilizing our personal experiences to help each other in this tough work. Because at the end of the day, you know, the police have stepped up to say they want to protect and serve communities, and we've got to hear from those communities and the police in order to come up with the solutions that we need. So thank you all for being here today. Just as a matter of protocol, we're going to have about 45 minutes or so where I'm going to ask questions of our panelists. And then we will have Q&A at the end. You certainly can feel free to add your questions to the chat, and they will be funneled to me as previously mentioned. So my first question is, the pandemic happened to coincide with the national defund movement. I think most of us would take issue with the term defund, but we would all welcome a conversation on the role of police when it comes to responding to public health related calls for service. From my experience, police would much rather not have to show up to move along homeless folks in a mental and behavioral health crisis or other folks who need services. They recognize that the gun and the badge and the taser that they show up with are not tools. They are usually helpful in these situations, and really prefer professionals to come in and help with that. So to the panelists, talk to us about how this has shown up in your city and some ideas forward, perhaps in some ways that you have kind of dealt with this issue where police are often called to handle public health issues. Judge Ernie Hart, you know, you sit at the intersection of a lot of these issues, and of course you're going to talk to us from a, you know, a legal perspective. But have you seen these issues crop up there in NYPD?
Oh, you look at not only, I know the topic of our discussion is policing during COVID, but as you mentioned, and as the commissioner mentioned before, we have a cross section of COVID. We have the civil rights marches. That in New York, some of them were a little violent. And then you also had the defund police movement, which kind of like intersected at the same time. And one of the things that we have found, or at least I found in New York, was that these three issues kind of had different aspects, different advocates. And at the end of the day, the public discussion was all over the place. And when the public discussion is all over the place, it gives the police a very difficult time in terms of what to do. For example, in the beginning, when all this COVID stuff happened, the issue was, yes, the police, we have the infrastructure, we're the ones who are going to enforce whatever we had to enforce. The problem is, it was a constant drumbeat of executive orders by the governor and the mayor, and then us in my department interpreting what they meant, and then giving our police officers in the field some direction of how to enforce all these new rules and regulations. That in of itself was a heavy task. Couple that with all the protests that were happening just after the start of COVID, and the need to not only enforce social distancing, but the wearing of masks, et cetera. That made the job that much more complicated, and complicated in that you had everybody wanted a different thing. We should enforce masks. We shouldn't enforce masks. Social distancing. Well, here you should enforce social distancing, but not here. We had basically an open discussion between politicians and policymakers of what to do. And then the police, always in the middle, were trying to figure out what exactly we were supposed to be doing. And we couldn't, it was very difficult at times to make everybody happy. Mm-hmm. Then you have the defund police movement, which took hold a little bit in New York, in that the New York City Police Department budget was cut by $1.5 billion, even though I believe that the New York City budget is about 4%, 5% of the total New York City budget, which is much lower than other police departments around the country. $1.5 billion from anybody's budget is significant. And this defund movement came at a time when we were supposed to be enforcing the wearing of masks, the social distancing, et cetera. Part of that was we had no more overtime. And if, for those of you who are police officers out there, the police departments run on overtime. I mean, anything goes awry, anything, you make an arrest, anything, it's overtime. So all these factors made the job of policing during this time very, very difficult. Now, New York City is engaged in trying to figure out a plan to open up restaurants. Restaurants have been closed for the most part. Restaurants and bars have been closed since March, I believe. Today, the governor indicated, from what I understand, that bars and restaurants could be open as of September 30th with 25% capacity. And the question was, who's going to enforce that? So again, you're going to have situations where if the police try to enforce it, that's one thing. Other people have argued maybe the health department should enforce things. So what I'm saying is this whole confluence of events and situations has made it quite an interesting time, certainly in New York City, but in any police department that has to deal with all these issues at the same time. In addition to the fact, the overall arching issue is, criminal justice reform, which we were engaged in before this. I was a judge. I sat in criminal court. I sat in New York State Supreme Court, and I'm the first one to tell you there needed to be criminal justice reform. Our bail laws were antiquated. They did not take into consideration some of the poor results that happened in the past. So again, another complication in policing. And then you have the police officers themselves. They're sitting around listening to all this, and they go, well, what are we supposed to do? Because like everybody, police officers are human beings just like everybody else, and everybody has an opinion on what to do. And then you have the unions. I'm just saying, it's a whole lot of things going on, and it's made policing during this time quite a task.
Yeah, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but to the point that you made, we were already dealing with in many of our in our communities strained relationships, and that's putting it mildly. And so when you have this confluence of, number one, different opinions of how things should be handled, number two, the distrust, number three, one of the things that we didn't talk about was increased violence, right? All these things coming together, it certainly does, make for a great opportunity for us to come out on the other side of this better, but certainly very difficult in the meantime. Professor Calaway, you come at this from a little bit different angle. Do you have anything for us on this subject?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being here today and being a part of the conversation. And I do appreciate what the commissioner has to say. I am standing at this moment in time from a very different perspective than a lot of people on the panel. I'm a professor of criminal justice and spent 2 decades as a criminal defense attorney. And I somewhat disagree with some of the assumptions that are being made today about this moment that we're in. In some ways, it's unique and different, but overall, I feel like what's happening right now with the virus has just put a magnifying glass on policing and the community relationship with the police. I got involved in a case here in Cincinnati where an individual was arrested for violating the stay-at-home order. And the whole situation, I feel like, is a perfect example of some of the problems that we have in the way that we deploy our police to enforce public order laws. And so I don't think what happened in my case, which I'll tell you about in a second, but is any different than what happens every day when the police are coming into contact with someone who is trespassing or publicly intoxicated or homeless or doing a number of these public order offenses. But my client was out videotaping on his phone and putting on Facebook Live a bunch of people who were out at night in violation of the stay-at-home order. And he was making a bunch of public comments about how he felt about the stay-at-home order, which was not positive. And so the police were not even aware that that was happening. They did not show up to that event. They did not arrest anyone that was there. But the law enforcement and the prosecutor in our town got so upset about that they actually sent the police to that man's house. They tracked him down on social media, sent him to that man's house the next day, and arrested him for what he had done with his Facebook Live videoing really what other people were doing. I mean, he was out too, but there were a bunch of people out there. They put him in jail. And we know, if you're following the coronavirus, that the top 10 hotspots for coronavirus right now in the United States are all in jails or prisons. So they put him in a jail where there are people living in close quarters and corrections officers and people that have to do their work. And the prosecutor advocated and somehow secured a $350,000 bond for a Black man who was out in public in violation of a stay-at-home order, criticizing the stay-at-home order. And there was a lot of rhetoric from the law enforcement about how they hoped he just stayed in jail and died. And so that's when I got involved, because this $350,000 bond for a low-level nonviolent offense, I mean, just patently absurd. And when I started digging into it, I saw that this is back in May, there had been 20 arrests in Cincinnati for violations of the stay-at-home order. I have the numbers. 6 of those arrests were white, 14 were Black, in a city that is a large majority of white people. And so then I looked at the bonds, and almost 100% of the white people were released without a financial consequence. Less than 50% of Black people were released with out of financial consequence. And of course, this particular Black man had to pay $350,000 if he wanted to get out of jail. So there was a lot going on in our city around this, but you juxtapose that next to a bunch of white women out at parks, college students in stadiums doing athletics, white protesters on the steps of the courthouse without masks, spitting in people's faces. None of those people got arrested. Nobody said boo about any of that. And so there's a large percentage of the population, including a lot of researchers like myself, who look at that and say, yeah, it's coronavirus, but it's really just kind of reflective of what a lot of people are seeing in their communities already. And so I hear that what the commissioner and others are saying, but I also feel like this isn't really all that unique. And we need to, as others have said, stop relying on the police to create this idea of public safety in our communities. That this is not the role of the police. We shouldn't depend on the police for this. And when the police get involved, this is the kind of thing that is bound to happen because they have limited tools at their disposal, as other people have noted.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that, we're going to get into a little bit into the panel. When I worked in the police department, the officer's office told me, ma'am, we just told. And granted, you know, there's discretion, and there's certainly, you know, police officers that shouldn't have a badge and a gun, and there's police officers that would agree with that, you know. But we also, I think, never really talk about the larger structure. I mean, it wasn't a police officer was told to go arrest that person. It was also a judge, and no disrespect to the judge that we have on the panel, but it was a judge that agreed to the $350,000 bail. And so, you know, like, I think what you're saying, the coronavirus has put a magnifying glass on a larger issue. But one of the things that I think needs to be discussed is really how police are used by the other governmental apparatus. And particularly while we're talking about fixing the relationship on one end, you can't then send them into a situation where they're almost inevitably going to be hated because of that. And so that's going to take me to my next question, which is Chuck Wexler of Perth recently said, community policing is supposed to be about engaging with the public, about building relationships. Having to break up a basketball game or tell people who are hanging out together that they have to disperse inherently causes a certain degree of tension. Asking police officers to go into Black and brown communities where the pandemic hit the hardest and where relationships are already strained could be argued hurts community policing efforts. How do you grapple with that issue or see it brought to bear in your work? What advice do you have for law enforcement to balance in carrying out these orders and not further eroding community trust? And Officer Sobota, you spend your days in the Houston community trying to figure out ways to bring folks together around some of these issues. Have you had to encounter some of these issues and grapple with them? And if so, how have you been able to handle that in Houston? You're muted. You're still muted. Oh, there you go.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Now we can. Yes, sir.
Okay. For some reason, I had to switch over to my cell phone. So, and I just joined right now, so I caught the very tail end. Can you briefly just ask me that again?
Sure. So, you know, basically the premise is there's already strained communities in our Black and brown communities. And we even talked about maybe even, you know, some of the communities that you came from with police. And when you're then sent to enforce the stay-at-home orders, the social distancing orders, when people are stressed out already because the pandemic has hit them the hardest, you know, health-wise, job-wise. The question is, have you had to encounter that in your work? Because you spend all day, you know, trying to bring together communities. And if you have had to deal with that, what are some of the ways that you have worked with communities and police officers to ease those tensions and not have them, you know, erode already tough relationship?
Very good question, and I want to thank you. You know, Houston is a very diverse city. I'm born and raised, low income, multicultural diversity town. Your question, and to answer that is, we have a lot of great training. Our police chief and the command staff insist that we have a lot of training. Now, the last 6 months and my 35 years is a total different game. And we have had so many policies in place that officers, whether you have 5 years or 30 years, that we have to adapt to. And going as far as the program that I run is the Positive Interaction Program. Every single station has officers that deals with these issues, with the people that are home. Maybe they lost their job, maybe they're having arguments with their family members, and sometimes the family members call the police. So officers have to respond to these issues that we've never had before in the city. And, you know, tempers start going, people maybe start drinking alcohol, so their behavior changes. So what we're seeing is we're having more calls for service, and the spike for, I wouldn't say crime, but calls for service because people are at home. So I'm training officers in the academy, whether you're in the academy or you have many, many years on. There's one word that I use. It's called patience. And next is training. We have very good training here. Now, as we all know, and those of you who maybe don't know, that George Floyd was from Houston. And then, of course, when we had the protest, we had a very big protest in the city of Houston. Our chief and command staff took charge, and they actually walked with the protesters. So I'm getting so many phone calls and going out to the community and dealing with. We have learned this in my 35 years, we're learning something very important in the new policing, and that is listening to people. Now, growing up as a kid in the 60s and even into the 70s, I remember, police officers really did not ever interact with your average person. They ran a call for service, they arrested somebody, put them in jail, and they went back out. So they did not have very good rapport with the public. That has changed, specifically in the last 6 months. So I guess to sort of briefly answer your question is training. It's very, very important. And with officers that have been around for a while, we got to almost, I would say, retrain them, but we have new policies and procedures dealing with this COVID and also any other type of police tension.
Thank you, Officer. We have Sobota, we have Chief Will Balling on the line. How have you dealt with this in your jurisdiction? In the meantime, Professor or Judge, do you have any comment on that question?
Well, sorry, Professor.
That's okay, go ahead.
I moved it first. Well, just to get back to something the professor said, I don't disagree basically with anything that you just said, in terms of the disparity in policing and racial biases. I mean, that's an issue. And I do believe that all these confluence of events highlighted this. I agree with that. And, the question is, how we deal with that going forward. But to get to your question, Ms. Martin, I think that in addition to what Officer Sobota said, it's not only training, but we have to teach police officers, and it's difficult to do this, but they have to use better discretion. I mean, the incident that Professor Calaway just referenced with the $350,000 for basically a not following social protocol, that's ridiculous. And frankly, that's something, I don't want to say this, but that's almost sanctionable. That's ridiculous. I mean, that is absolutely ridiculous. But when you have incidents like that, that kind of like messes up everybody's perception, or makes it more difficult to achieve that synergy between the community and police. A lot of times police officers, we had a case in New York City. I don't want to talk too much about it. I don't know if there's a lawsuit going on, but there was an incident that involved not wearing a mask. And while the police were very patient in dealing with this individual, eventually there was an arrest because this particular person hit a cop. All right, you can't do that. All right, but on the other hand, one would say, well, just let it go. But when you give police officers a task, so this is, police, the paramilitary organizations, when you give them a task, they're going to do the best to carry out the task. And in doing that, I find that I've only been here a year and a half to NYPD, but I find that a lot of times things can be avoided if you just look the other way. You don't, just because you can do something, that doesn't mean you have to. I mean, what Professor Calaway said, going to somebody's house and raising that to the level that was described, I mean, that was ridiculous. That's not, you can't even argue in favor. Like, I'm sure there's another side of that. Somebody will say, well, that didn't happen. But as described, that's not even defensible. So I do believe that if nothing else, this whole idea of this whole COVID thing has brought to the fore, what is the role of the police? The police are called for everything, whether it's domestic disputes, whether it's somebody had a drug overdose, social distancing and wearing masks, and somebody's having a psychological psychotic episode, call the police. So that's rightfully the discussions about whether or not the police should be involved in this is real. However, you can't make snap decisions. For example, New York City has taken a lot of time and effort to, when there's a person that's having some kind of psychotic episode, New York City has taken pains to notify the police officers that person may have a history, because they want to be, they should be informed about what's going on. So the other argument is, well, send, social workers or whatever. And that's all well and good, but you're not going to get social workers to respond to that until they feel that they're safe. So yes, good discussion, but the solution isn't necessarily easy.
Yeah, the solution is definitely not easy. And I think there's two components to it. There is a big picture solution, like, should we defund the police? Do we need police in our community? Whatever that conversation is. And then there's also, well, what can we do right now about this situation? And I actually just had a conversation with a police officer the other day talking about some individual who was drunk in front of a store, and he went and got him and arrested him and took him to jail for disorderly conduct. And I said, do you ever just think take him home? And he looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language, like, well, no, I don't think my captain would like me to just take people home when they're committing crimes. And so it's like, I don't know if officers aren't empowered to do that, or if they just don't think about doing it, but not everything needs to result in an arrest and someone going to jail. But the officers I interact with certainly don't seem to be able to either have the power to make those decisions or the thought process to come up with some other kind of solution to a simple problem like that.
Yeah, and here's the thing that I'll say, and then I'll segue us. I think, Professor, you hit on a very important point. And it's something that the judge brought up as well, is this issue of discretion. I know that at some of the police departments I've worked with, that the legal department would have told them, an intoxicated person, you don't know what they're intoxicated on or with, for you to take them home and leave them there creates liability on us that we do not want. And so, it's not, and we have a question from Stephen and Leganke, if I'm saying that correctly, about the influence that the media has on some of these conversations. I think how I've been describing is as the adults, and I don't mean the police, the adults, the lawyers, the politicians, the county executives, the mayors, everybody needs to get together and actually take a step back and say, how do we empower? How do we make it very clear? Because one of the things that we're not going to talk about here on this panel is, if you ask a lot of police, they are worried about their own justice inside of the police department, such that if they do something outside of policy, or that their captain or their lieutenant or their sergeant does not condone, then who's going to have their back when they decide of their own discretion that maybe the best thing that they want to do out of their heart is to take that person home? But then when they show back up tomorrow, is the structure inside of the police department going to support that, or have them hang out to dry? And that's a real issue. And so I think, again, having these conversations with all of the different voices at the table that ask those straight questions like you just put forward, so that the training that we're doing, the policies that we put together, actually empower police to do the things that they need. The last thing I'll say is, often, unfortunately, police are not involved in the policy decisions that are made that affect them on the front lines. So I think that's something else that needs to happen, is not only the community voice needs to be brought in, but the police voice needs to be brought in, because you often, to your point, create policies that actually don't empower them to be the community officer that everybody's saying that they want. I'll put this out there. I'll say my 2 cents on the media. I think, unfortunately, and I fought this battle in Baltimore, the clicks, is how they stay in business. People do not click on community police event, basketball, everybody's happy. They click on 12 dead, they click on police brutality, they click on these things. And so I think the media plays a huge, even this defund conversation. The truth of the matter is the community and the police actually believe the same thing about the defund conversation to a certain degree, but nobody's talking about that middle ground. So I believe the media plays a huge part and that they'll continue to be divisive. And it's going to be hard to work with them. The question is, there is a way to partner with them to ensure the public sees the positive as well as the highlighted needs for change. Does anybody have anything else to add to what I've said?
I do. Generally speaking, I don't think we have a problem in our society with people having a negative view of the police. I understand that there's some headlines and there's some communities where the police are not liked, but overall, I don't think there's a group of people that are more beloved in our country than police officers. And so I disagree about the media. I mean, yes, they're driven by clicks and a lot of that, but they do an amazing service for our community by telling us when these things are happening. I think that by putting out there when the police are shooting unarmed Black men, that's really important. And people in our community need to know about that. And while that's only been in the forefront the last few years because there hasn't been video evidence of it, it's been happening for a really long time. And so now in 2020, we're finally, after 200 years, able to have a conversation about structural racism and police use of force and what that's looking like and the harms that are coming to our society. And so I think that the reason we get to have those conversations a lot is because the media is sort of driving those conversations. So yeah, I think that they're playing an important role here. And I don't think that the police are, I mean, anytime I'm in trial, so this is just anecdotal, but if a police officer walks in a uniform and says something, it doesn't matter if I have him on video saying something else, the jurors are going to believe what the police officer says. So putting a uniform on and walking around in the community carries an enormous amount of power. The public supports the police. And so because that's true, I think there's even more of an onus on the public and on people who care about what's happening to make sure that that responsibility is being taken seriously and not abused. I don't think that there's a perception problem. I think there's an actual problem with our police in general.
Okay, thank you for that, Professor. And I will say, I think to your point that it's important for this to be a national conversation because the state's attorneys in Baltimore have the complete opposite, time when.
Fair enough.
All right, so anyone else on that? I'm going to skip to our next question.
Yes, Ms. Martin. This is Chief Balling I'm from Sidney Police Department and also represent Ohio Association of Chiefs of Police. Well, I think there's room for improvement. We're talking about the COVID situation and the other situations going on. In law enforcement, we can definitely improve. But I think what's going on also is we're treated like a political football right now. We are the spearhead. We're the point of all this dynamics coming forward with this, with different views. When you're a young man and you start on a department, you'll find out that everyone loves the fireman, but everyone hates a police officer because we're called when people are dealing with the worst situations or when they're arrested or you have to take a family member away. The COVID situation has heightened some of this dynamics because we're not able to get out in the field and talk with people. During these demonstrations, we need to be out there. Law enforcement needs to be out working with the demonstrators, talking about the issues, because the only way you build trust is through conversations. People have perceptions. I'm sure all 5 of us on this panel have perceptions about what is right and what is wrong. But until you have those honest conversations and learn how people feel, you're not going to change this. The dynamics that we're dealing with are no different than in the 60s and 70s. We've always had these issues and we always will. It's how we respond to these events and how we build upon that and learn from it and improve. Unfortunately, right now you do hear a lot. I differ a little with Wendy on the media because a lot of them are sensationalized. But you probably haven't heard about the 2 officers in Cleveland, Ohio that were just killed. You probably can't name their names. You can't name the names of the Toledo officer that was killed recently. And these situations are not more important or less important, but it is part of the topic that we have to move on. With the COVID situation, it added that other layer, as a judge and officer said. We're not able to get out and deal with the people like we should. We're putting on dynamics of being liquor enforcement. We're putting on dynamics of being park patrol police and kicking people off of playgrounds. So we have to work together in this situation to build up those relationships, work with people, and have those conversations. So I agree with everyone here, but we need to remember 98% of police are actually trying to do the best they can, and we need to support those that are doing those community efforts.
Thank you for that, Chief. We have another question from Gary Silva. It's a follow-up to Judge Hart. Do government officials place law enforcement in precarious positions by tasking them with carrying out non-enforceable and often political-based tasks? In this case, the pandemic aspects of social distancing, face coverings, etc. The situation can quickly turn bad and police are then criticized for being involved in the first place.
Well, I would never say that the police could not do what they're asked to do. I don't necessarily think that's a question. The question is, should they be doing it? Should a police officer tell somebody to put a mask, and if you don't put a mask, you can't go into this store? I mean, that was a big issue about how do you enforce. I think the former Boston commissioner, and he talked about that. How do you, we had in New York, we had this COVID task force. We had an actual 3-star chief in charge of this COVID task force to try to enforce social distancing in stores. In the beginning, how many people were in supermarkets? How were they spaced at the checkout? So it is difficult because whenever you have the main role of the police is to enforce law and order. We do have a robust program in New York City with neighborhood policing, trying to get back to basics. But as I said before, when you give police officers a task, it's interpreted as a law enforcement task. It's given to them to enforce. So when you do that, it's not that it's impossible, it just causes friction. Nobody wants to be told they can't do X because they don't have a mask on. Nobody likes to be told you can't do this because you're not 6 feet away from somebody. So inherently, when it doesn't matter if it's the police, could be anybody. When anybody's told to do or not to do something in these circumstances, it's going to cause friction. So I do think there's a valid discussion to be had as to whether or not the police should be the ones enforcing this. But the problem, when things go bad, we've had situations where things have gone bad, where members of the public said, you're not wearing a mask, and the fight starts, breaks out. Police aren't there. The police aren't the ones who are doing enforcing. So the public has a vital role here to act like normal human beings as well. I mean, we're talking about a public health crisis. We're talking about all these other things. It would be a lot easier and a lot better if everybody just said, okay, we're in a public health crisis, let's follow the rules. But no. So if the police get involved, it's an indication that somebody's not following the rules, and then you get negative consequences as a result. So I don't think it's an impossible task. I just think it's an unfortunate task.
Professor Calaway, I've been on this panel with you long enough. I can just look at your face and tell you have something to say. So go ahead.
Well, I feel like a sort of theme is developing here that I want to address. I understand if we're going to accept for purposes of our discussion that the police are being asked to do something and maybe they shouldn't be, but they are. So what do we do? I would like to suggest that if the police are getting involved in situations where maybe they don't think it's appropriate or whatever, but it's not their decision to make, that doesn't doesn't mean that they need to kick the door in and start shooting people. And so perhaps the conversation needs to be about, like, how are these officers making decisions about how to get involved and where to get involved? The commissioner said that the police are there ultimately to enforce law and order, but we know that the police enforce the law and order some of the time and some of the places to some of the people, right? In my city, the stay-at-home order was being enforced against the Black folks. The white people were free to go about their day in the parks and doing whatever they want. The public intoxication laws and the open container laws and things like that are enforced pretty seriously in over the Rhine and in places where Black people hang out, but I can walk around in my neighborhood with an open container and no one's gonna say boo to me. So when we decide how we're gonna enforce and how we're gonna get involved in these difficult conversations, the choices we make can create a lot of resentment and a lot of tension in the community that we're working in. And so if we're going to say, well, we have to do this because people are saying we have to do it, I think we need to look more carefully at exactly how the police are being deployed, when they're being deployed, who they're being deployed against.
Yeah, I definitely.
Just in New York City, I will give you an example. It's amazing how, we have this 311, the non-emergency calls to the police. Amazing how many 311 calls that came into the police department as, this house of worship is not following the rules, or this restaurant is not, or this barbershop is not doing the rules. It's not following the rules. And a lot of the things that we came across was because of those. We didn't, like I say, we weren't targeting anybody per se. But Professor, I agree with you in that, yes, there is issues with disparate policing. No doubt about it. And that's, New York has just gone through a whole episode, and it's still dealing with it with the criminal justice reform. How do we enforce our laws? Why is there a disparity between population and arrests depending on race? And I teach this stuff too, so I'm up on this. I'm up on this as well. And a lot of the students I teach community college, they are of color, and I ask them, what has been their experience? And I will say this, give you an example of discretion. Yes, part of it is disparate policing. We have to get to the issue as to why. Is it racism? Certainly, that's part of it. I'll give you, but I think that discretion and that decision making has to be involved. I was telling Ms. Martin of an episode when I was a judge. There was a young man, I was sitting in night court, and there was a young man who came out. He was 16 years old. At the time, this is before we had the raise the age, so now it's 18, so he wouldn't be arrested at 16, he'd go to family court. But he was arrested for violating a ordinance that said you can't take up 2 seats on a subway. So this young man basically stayed in jail because he had no ID. He stayed in jail overnight. He was Latino. Stayed in jail overnight because he didn't have ID and he was taking up 2 seats on a subway. Now, forget about whether or not, what was going through the police officer's mind or whatever. I remember that kid coming out before me, and I literally apologized. And I went to the cops. We're not getting into, the whole idea of how arraignments work in New York City. And I said, I apologize. And I turned to the cops. I said, what? Not the police officer, but I said, what is going on? And the DA, I said, what are you doing? So this kid forever had this bad experience with the police. He had no record, nothing. And that's another problem. Arrests, even if they're ultimately dismissed, they have consequences. Mm-hmm. So, that's why I said it's not like, we'll take care of it later. I mean, some people have the attitudes, we'll just deal with it. No, they have consequences. It's not like, we'll let the criminal. That's a decision that was made that I thought was a poor decision. I told this to the police commissioner, and he agrees. He's very, Commissioner Shea here is very aware, very understanding, and is in tune with this idea of decisions. You know, how we make decisions, how we use our discretion. Bhakti brought up a case where because of policy, this 8-year-old kid or 6-year-old kid was put in handcuffs because he was acting out in class. I mean, who does, that's not a right decision, you know? So again, this whole idea of disparate policing, whether or not the criminal justice system is racially biased, all that stuff, but discretion is a big part of that.
Yeah, and I think this conversation is really surfacing, not that it needs to be surfaced because it's very obvious, this rift and this lack of trust that is, you know, centuries old. And so one of the questions that we have here is going to Chief Balling about how has the COVID virus hampered our ability to have the much needed conversations on police improvements, and how we can overcome these obstacles to build trust and understanding. Certainly the things that we're talking about here are not helping that conversation.
With the COVID situation, a lot of departments have cut back on their community service programs. With the fear of spreading of the COVID disease, with the fear of interaction, at least through the state of Ohio, a lot of the programs that we normally would, the meet and greets, the safety town, citizen academies, has been delayed. So that has hampered a lot of our normal interaction on a non-police law enforcement purpose. I think that the COVID situation has created some of the barriers and non-conversations that we normally would have. I'll use our own town for example. We had some very peaceful demonstrators that just wanted to come out and make their points, have their voices heard. We went out there with law enforcement in masks and walked with them around our court square and talked with them. And we wanted to have a larger conversations, but due to COVID limitations of getting together with groups, we wasn't able to have that. And as we said here, part of the learning process is learning what each other's thinking, not assuming our way is correct or somebody else's way is correct, is having those conversations. So what we started doing is forming smaller groups of how we could proceed and build upon these conversations once we can return to normal, to get ideals, to get functions on how to proceed and what information needs to be out there. And that's one of the things that I found out. People just wanted the information, whether it was number of traffic stops, number of field identifications, how we decide on who we stop and don't. So right now I would give people advice on law enforcement is to continue to keep having those conversations, but try to identify what information people need to make their own informed decisions and not go into it with your mind made up that it's one way or another from both sides. So I think that's how it got hampered and not.
Thank you for that, Chief. We have a question, one thing I do want to raise that I've seen, and we've seen this in education, certainly, and we're talking about equitable policing, but a lot of community meetings have gone to Zoom and Wi-Fi and things of that nature, which, you know, a lot of our communities do not have, and the communities who need to probably communicate with the police the most. Again, it just goes back to a lot of the systemic issues that we've got to deal with. So there's another question here. This one is from Bonnie Watt, Officer Sobota. This one's for you. How strong do you try to instill in the trainees about the importance of discretion and patience that can make a real difference in whether somebody's taken to jail or not? You're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you for that question. You know, during our training, and I think we spoke about this last week, you know, and of course, the judge and people brought this point up. You know, nobody calls the police to say, hey, I'm having a good day, I'm having a baby, I got a new car. People call the police because there's a serious issue. Probably a law has been broken. So, you know, we try to train in the academy, and we train them to say, you know, every call is different. And it's very important, you know, maybe you got into a confrontation, maybe you had to deal with some very serious issues on that last call. But we're training people, officers, to have patience. That next call may and probably will not be the same scenario for the next one. The next call, the next several calls, you will have to have more maybe patience, compassion, and listen to what's going on. And you know, I try to train officers. You know, that next call for service, act like they're your, you know, your loved ones, your family members, your brothers, your sisters, and try to have compassion and understand. It's obvious, you know, if the situation has become very violent or bad, or they're breaking the law, or if public safety is in jeopardy, of course you have to detain them and determine what your plan of action is going to be. But our training is patience, common sense, good judgment, and follow our policies. You know, we have a chief here in Houston and the command staff. They're very good, and they, you know, we have rewrote a lot of the policies that reflects a positive image of our police department for several years, and it has worked out. Of course, every situation is not perfect. I can't sit here and say that, you know, our internal affairs don't get complaints from time to time, but I think our training in the past 5 to 6 years has really improved, where we have to train officers, and that may be a beat officer that's been in that same beat or that same station for 30 years. You know, it's a different time. 2020 is a total different time now that we have to really service the public. And I think some officers forget that, you know, we're public servants. So we really have to make sure that the officers are aware of it. And don't forget it.
Thank you for that, Officer Sobota. So we have been joined by Eric Adams, president of the Brooklyn, New York Bureau. And he comes to us with a very unique perspective. He's been both officer and now politician. And so we definitely want to bring him into this conversation. Welcome, Mr. President. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I could. And please feel free to call me Eric. That's what my mama named me, and I just love that name.
Oh, you just made it hard, because I was about to say, well, you earned that president name, but you got your mama into it, so now I gotta call you Eric. Well, thank you, and welcome. We're so glad to have you. Just to give you a bit of context, so we really have been having a conversation today about the role of police, and you know, that, you know, they're put in a position, they're given the order, and in a paramilitary organization, they go and follow through. And whether they really should be in a situation of enforcing public health orders, you know, telling people to stay home, breaking up basketball games, breaking up barbecues. We've also talked about how it's been enforced in certain areas in a disparate way, where, you know, you have African Americans, you know, getting more citations, getting arrested, and having higher bails. And so that's what we've been talking about for the last about hour. And so one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, having been on both sides, and I've worked for a mayor, and then I went over and worked for a police commissioner, and the pressures in both of those roles manifest very differently. And so talk to us about, you know, this idea of the police, what I used to hear all the time, ma'am, we're just doing what we're told, which often came from the politician's office. How do you balance that? And what's the advice for police officers that find themselves in very difficult positions and trying to manage this situation?
Thank you. A lot was in that question to really pick apart, and so probably we'll just address it in layers as the conversation continues. First, there's another aspect of my evolution to where I am now as the Brooklyn Borough president, is that I was arrested as a child, and I was beat bad by police officers, my brother and I. And, you know, for the first part of my young upbringing, there was nothing I wanted to do around police. For the most part, of what I thought was the symbol of safety was really crushed and destroyed. And it wasn't until a group of civil rights leaders asked me and 12 other young men to go into law enforcement to fight from within after a businessman named Arthur Miller was killed through a chokehold, and a young man named Randolph Evans was shot by a police officer. And I reluctantly did, and I went in and started an organization of 100 Blacks in Law Enforcement Who Care. We were a civil rights organization within the police department. So I think it's important to get that context to understand this, who I am as a person and why this conversation is so important to me. Policing is a noble profession. And I don't think there is a greater level of individuals who are willing to put on a bulletproof vest and stand on street corners and run towards gunshots and save the lives of people. For the most part, they don't know. But the reality is that those of us who are in the profession did not hold up the nobility of that profession by allowing individuals who are not suitable to be of this noble profession to be among us. We have been silent. And when I say we, many of the advocates and the groups in policing, we were silent when Abner Louima was shot 44 times, or when Diallo was shot at 44 times, and Adam Louima was sodomized. And we had cops in New York who were part of the Dirty 30. They used to rob drug dealers and then sell the drug proceeds, the 77 Mark Boys. We should have been spending our time of saying, if you want to be among us and part of us, then you must reach the level of nobility that this profession brings. And we didn't do a good job in doing that. And then on the other half is society on the whole. I think Jack Nicholson's quote in A Few Good Men of "you really don't want to know the truth." Let's be clear. Society from all over this country, all big cities and even smaller cities, we tell police, go out and do your job. And we really don't want to know how you're carrying out that job. We're addicted to 911. We call police for everything and anything. And then when it's time to critique their interaction, we look back over it and say, why did you handle it in that way? And I think that's a big mistake that we're doing in society. And we need to think differently about the ecosystem of public safety. Lastly, we need to understand how one's brain operate. The officer mentioned, and I thought it was so important, you don't call the police to invite them to the birthday party. You call them when the party was shot up. If every encounter our police departments are receiving is a negative encounter, their brains, neurologists would tell you, their brains begins to define the communities they're policing as a ball of chaos and negativism. I'll never forget when I was training a rookie police officer and I was a lieutenant, we walked into one of our public housing developments and someone urinated in the elevator. And he said, you see, Lou, these people don't deserve anything. They urinate in the elevator. They do all of these terrible things to where they live. And I told the young officer, I said, one person urinated in the elevator. Everyone in this building is upset about that. But if you define the people of that building based on the actions of one or two people, then you believe that they're not deserving of the policing that you would give to your own family members. We have to change how we train police, how they interact in the communities that they're policing, and then we need to diversify our departments and make sure that people are part of the communities that they are making safe in the first place.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for that. I wish you were on here the whole time. You would added quite a bit to this conversation. I have gotten my my notice actually to start wrapping up a little bit. So I'm going to start in the line, and then I'm gonna come back to you, Mr. President Eric, to give us some final words at the end. So, Professor, can I start with you on any final thoughts that you have about the subject matter, and certainly anything that we didn't hit. Certainly, we only had 45 minutes on such a tough topic, but yes, any final words?
Well, thank you, and you've done a great job. Thank you for moderating this. But I would like to echo some of the things that Eric said, if I can say Eric also. He has said that we need to re-examine the ecology of public safety, and that is so true. We need to start thinking a little bigger about what it means to be safe. We focus on violent crime, murder, people breaking into your home. The reality is that that's really only about 4% of what police do. And so, but there's lots of ways that we in our community are in danger, from cigarette smoke to speeding to people texting and driving, all these things that we don't pay very much attention to or don't count as public safety, but there's a lot more people being harmed by them. And so I think as a society, we need to think broader. I also think my takeaway from this discussion is that the defund the police and the police that we're talking to are a lot closer than I thought. The defund the police want to move some resources around to give the people who are actually trained to deal with public order and mental health and drug addiction the resources to do that. And it sounds like we're in agreement that that needs to be done. And so we can let the police deal with that smaller segment of violent crime that's out there that needs to be addressed. Obviously, there's lots of other things that need to be done, but I actually come away from this discussion hopeful that maybe we're a little closer than I thought.
Great, thank you. Oh, am I muted? No. Thank you so much for that, Professor. And I think that that's why these conversations are so important. And we often assume that we're so far on the different ends of the spectrum that we can't find some middle ground. And so I really thank you for that and all the work that you have done on behalf of the citizens in your city and all, of course, all the great things you're teaching to your students. Let's come to you, Judge Hart, for any final thoughts or words.
Well, let me say this, since I'm Deputy Police Commissioner NYPD, I will call Eric Adams Mr. Borough President, because that's what we do. And I agree with everything that he said. I think that, and he does have a unique perspective in policing. The one thing I would add, though, is it's something that I hearkened to, in the earlier part of our discussion was, it would be, in New York City, we have so many, not talking about the advocacy groups, but the people who run New York City, the mayor, the city council, the politicians, it would be helpful if everybody would come to like a consensus. Case in point, every time, if it's a defund movement or it's other things going on in the city council, there's all this division and whatever, and then the police kind of like get caught, what are we supposed to be doing? So again, I think that's part of the discussion and it's part of the solution, that I think the police sometimes feel that it's us against them. I mean, I don't know if you agree with that, Mr. Borough President, but the police certainly get that feeling sometimes, and it makes it difficult for them just as a human being to do what they think is best. Not to say that they shouldn't be doing their best all the time, but I think that with all the rhetoric, there was talk about the press and whatever, all that stuff, police officers as individuals are hearing all this stuff. And they walk into a situation, what are we supposed to do? You don't want us to do the enforce wearing a mask. You don't want us to do social distancing. You don't want us to do this. I think that policymakers, not only within the police department, but across any government, I think it would be helpful if there were clear messages coming from elected and appointed leaders.
Yeah, Your Honor, Deputy Commissioner, I 100% agree with you. And one of the things that we didn't get to talk about today, but I think is really important, we have had the highest number of deaths among police officers, this year because of COVID, number one, because they are frontline, they don't get to stay in an office. They have to go out and do the things that they're told, number one. Number two, just in the past couple of weeks, the departments that I've worked with, I've heard about officers killing themselves. The suicides are up. One hung himself. And so, again, I think that it's so important that the politicians, because they really are the ones with the power and the influence, take into consideration the human beings. To what Eric said, the way that just how policing affects you mentally, physically, and then when you are hated just because of the uniform that you wear, whether you're a person that got up every morning and just came out to serve and protect, also knowing that you could be taking home a deadly disease to your loved ones. All of those things, to the best of a human being, are difficult to juggle. And so I think that we definitely need to take more time to not have, as someone said, police officers be a political football, because I've seen that way too often. So I'm going to come to you, Officer Sobota, and ask you if you have any final words on either officer wellness and how you can take care of yourself, or this issue that we've discussed today about equitable policing in the time of COVID. You're on mute. Mute. Mute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for letting me respond on this. I'd like to agree with everybody on this panel. I can truly, sitting here processing everything. Of course, Eric, the judge, the professor, everybody has a lot of experience just by listening to you, and everybody has some very important input on this. One thing I'd like to just remind everybody and just kind of tell everybody what we're doing here in Houston. Community service is very important. Now, 20 years ago when I was on the street, the old police term, cuffing and stuffing. Well, I never thought I'd be here on this panel today talking about this. We all have learned so much. Now, one thing about community service, the stakeholders in the communities, every single community is important, no matter what skin color you are, how much money you have. We have learned that through these meetings, we go out to the community. They come to us every other month, and we listen to everybody, whether you're a grandmother, whether you're a single mom, whether you're a 16 or 18-year-old student that has experienced maybe some negative things, some positive things. It's very important to listen to everybody and to process this. And something that maybe we have learned. Now, in some cases, it's maybe somebody doesn't understand the process of us being police officers, of us running calls for service. And I think somebody had mentioned, 911. Yes, most officers, when they're in a car and they're running calls for service, they respond to what a dispatcher sends us to. And somebody in that community called us. But again, training is very important. And just remember that we're dealing with human beings, and we listen to them. And of course, some of the advocates from every single neighborhood has come to us with problems. And some of them have been angry, when they're in waiting rooms and they come in, they're pounding their hands on the desk wanting change. But a lot of them, once we deal with them and we take action and listen to and work with them in a positive way, we just don't tell them, well, that's just the way it's going to be, and that's our policy, and you just go back to your neighborhood. We never do that. We come to common grounds. And what's amazing is some of these advocates that they weren't happy with police service. Once we worked out things together, they end up being some of our board of directors in these community service as board members. And they have gone back to their communities and said, we learned a lot, whether that community learned a lot or the police has learned more about the community or something that maybe needs to be addressed.
Yes.
So, and Houston is a very diverse, we're getting every culture. They say we're right at 2.3 million. And of course, I know in New York, you have much more, and some of the other cities you may have less. But we're right at over 5,000 police officers. And it's amazing to hear maybe in New York, you have tens of thousands of officers. But I'm born and raised in Houston. I'm seeing a very positive change. And I think I told you a week ago that, you know, growing up as a kid here in Houston, when you waved at a police officer, they never waved back. It just wasn't good. But I said, someday I'm going to become a police officer and change that, along with the thousands of other police officers that are currently working now with the Houston Police Department. But again, training, having a good chief and a command staff, and having great citizens that understand. And lastly, I'd like to say, you know, in the past several months, where police brutality and you know the way that the media is projecting a lot of it, I'm really shocked that when I go out in the public and get out of my car, and I'm having a lot of people, different ages, from college students to senior citizens, stopping me and saying, "Officer, we're behind you. God bless you. You know, we understand some of what you're going through, and we're behind you." And I said, "Wow," you know, and we're all saying, "Wow." But you know, there's always a segment that are not happy with us.
Now
But
that's
overall, I think we're projecting a good image.
Well, Officer Sobota, we thank you for your service and what you do every day, and appreciate you being here on this panel. And now we are a little bit behind in letting people go. If you don't mind, and I was going to come to Eric last, but I think I'm going to hand it to him because he looks like he's at his destination, and then we'll round it out with you, Chief Balling. So if President Eric, if you have any last words for us.
Thank you very much. And I believe the mere fact that we are speaking and communicating is so important. But again, I want to emphasize that policing is a noble profession. Our police officers, they have two authorities that even the President of the United States is not in possession of: the right to take away liberty and the right to take a life. That is in our Constitution. And with that noble profession, I think all officers should understand that political times would change, the climate would change, there would be conservatives and liberal policymakers and decision makers. But when you put on that uniform and put on that shield and put that gun on your side, you are immune to all the political winds and the political changes. You do not have the luxury to be angry, to feel as though you're going to not do your job because you're upset with the law that was passed. I was upset many times as a police officer because of a bill, law, policymakers that never patrol our streets made the decisions on us. But I knew the public should never be held hostage because of my anger of foolish policies. I don't like some of the policies that are being passed now in our state houses and our civil city councils. But the reality is the public must be protected. Public safety is a prerequisite to prosperity. And whenever your anger reaches the point that you could no longer protect the public, then this is not the occupation for you. You should find another occupation.
Absolutely. 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 Well, we thank you for your time. We thank you for your service. So happy to have you today, and really do appreciate those words. And if I was in New York, I would vote for you too. Thank you. Thank you. All right, Chief, let's round it on out. What are your words for us?
I'd just like to thank everybody here on the panel and everybody online. The health and wellness of officers have to also be taken into consideration. You guys do a very dangerous job. Everybody's listening to this does a very dangerous job. It's taking the toll on the mental health, the wellness of officers. Officers are actually dying 21 years earlier than the average citizen. And I think we need to address that, because the better physical shape we're in, the better mental shape we're in, the better we can serve our community. The National Law Enforcement Memorial talks about that with Destination Zero programs and other programs. We have to take care of the people that are taking care of the citizens and move forward on this. And having these discussions and having these solutions come up will help us in this field. So thank everybody for being on this line and having these conversations.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
And Ganesha, thank you very much for moderating this panel. And I'd like to thank all of our incredible panelists. We appreciate your participation in today's discussion. The National Law Enforcement Memorial Museum has become the nation's gathering place for the important conversations and partnerships and ideas that bring law enforcement and communities they serve together. And today's program is a good example of that, because it is here at this museum where our greatest thought leaders in law enforcement, civic responsibility, and social change come together to engage in solution-based discussions. So join us on September 30th for our next event, which is being held in collaboration with Thomson Reuters Institute. The program, Technology, Training, and New Policing Guidelines in America, will highlight perspectives from prominent industry leaders and observers on the future of policing in America. So thank you to our sponsor, Target, and we will see you in a few weeks.